In the spring of 2023, a machine sat the bar exam and beat 90% of the humans who take it. Weeks later, one wrong answer in a demo erased $100 billion in an afternoon. The most powerful technology ever built had arrived all at once, and everyone started to run. When we left off, a single blinking cursor had met the world, and the pendulum that swings through this whole story between logic and data, between certainty and doubt, was trembling at the center, refusing to stop. Then it lurched. What happened next did not take a century or a decade. It took about 12 months. In a single year, the quiet research preview became a global gold rush. Hundreds of billions of dollars, every giant on Earth, all sprinting at once toward the same machine. And here is the strange part. The closer they got, the more frightened they became. The men building the thing began signing letters begging the world to slow down. The grandfather of the whole field walked out of his own laboratory to warn us. And in the most powerful company of all, the board looked at the man racing fastest toward the future and fired him. Then unfired him 5 days later. Heaven and the bomb arriving on the same calendar. This is the year the dream became a war.
For a few months, the world wondered if ChatGPT had been a fluke, a clever party trick that would wear off. On the 14th of March, 2023, OpenAI answered that question with GPT-4. This was not a slightly better chatbot. It could see. You could hand it an image and it would explain the joke in it. It took the United States bar exam, the brutal test that gatekeeps the legal profession, and scored in the top 10% of human test takers. The previous version had scored in the bottom 10. It passed graduate exams in biology, in economics, in art history, as if it had idly absorbed every textbook on the planet, which, in a sense, it had. And that was the starting gun, because the moment GPT-4 landed, every executive in every boardroom on Earth had the same two thoughts in the same order. First, this changes everything. Second, and far more urgent, our competitors are going to have this, and we do not. The race that would consume the next 3 years and a sizable fraction of the world's electricity began not with wonder, but with fear of being left behind. No one had more to lose than Google. For 20 years, Google had been a verb. It had quietly invented the very transformer that made all of this possible, and it employed some of the finest minds in the field. And it had been caught flat-footed by a startup. Inside Google, leadership declared a code red, the corporate equivalent of pulling the fire alarm. The founders, semi-retired, came back to the building. Their first answer, a chatbot called Bard, stumbled out of the gate and confidently got a fact wrong in its very first public demo, wiping $100 billion off the company's value in an afternoon. So Google did something it had resisted for years. It took its two crown jewels, Google Brain and the legendary DeepMind, the lab that had built the AI that conquered the game of Go. And on the 20th of April, 2023, it fused them into a single weapon, Google DeepMind. By December, that weapon had a name of its own, Gemini, a model built from the ground up to be multimodal, to read, see, and hear at once. The sleeping giant was awake, it was frightened, and it was very, very large. But this was never only a two-horse race. While OpenAI pushed and Google scrambled, a third path had been quietly walking its own road since 2021. 2 years earlier, a group of senior researchers had walked out of OpenAI. At their center were a brother and sister, Dario and Daniela Amade. They left over a single, stubborn disagreement, not about whether to build powerful AI, but about how carefully. They founded a company whose entire identity was the thing the rest of the industry treated as a speed bump: safety. They called it Anthropic, and they called their model Claude. Here is the detail that tells you everything about this third faith. By some accounts, Anthropic had a model as capable as ChatGPT before ChatGPT was ever released, and chose to sit on it, afraid of what releasing it might unleash. In a gold rush, they were the ones double-checking the dynamite. When Claude finally arrived in full in 2023, it carried that DNA, helpful, careful, and built around the oldest question in this entire series. Not can we make the machine powerful, but can we keep it pointed at what we actually want? The pendulum's deepest tension, power against control, now had a company built on each side. So far, Every one of these machines lived behind a wall. You could talk to them, but you could never look inside. They were cathedrals, and you were a visitor. Then, Meta, yes, the Facebook company, did something that horrified its rivals. It gave the engine away. In February of 2023, it released a powerful model called Llama. And that July, Llama 2, with the weights, the actual learned brain of the model, opened for nearly anyone to download, modify, and run on their own machine, for free. Overnight, the dream escaped the labs. A student in a dorm room, a startup in a garage, a researcher in a country with no AI giant of its own. Suddenly, all of them had a frontier-class mind on a hard drive. Some called it democratization. Others called it handing out the blueprints to the bomb. And so, a new front opened in the war, one that runs straight through the heart of this series. Open against closed. Should this power be locked in a vault and rented out by the careful few? Or set loose in the wild, where no one can ever put it back?
And as the gold rush roared, the oldest character in this story returned, wearing a new mask. Fear. In March of 2023, an open letter appeared, signed by more than 30,000 people, among them some of the most respected names in technology and science. Its request was simple and astonishing. Pause. Stop training anything more powerful than GPT-4 for at least 6 months before we lose the thread entirely. No one paused. The race was already too fast to stop. Then, that May, the warning got personal. Geoffrey Hinton, the man whose work on neural networks half a century earlier had made every one of these machines possible, the very figure we will one day crown with a Nobel Prize, quietly resigned from Google. Not to start a company, to be free to tell the world he was afraid of what he had helped build. He spoke of machines that might one day be smarter than us and might decide they no longer needed us. Governments, sensing the ground shifting, scrambled to respond. An American executive order, a global safety summit in an English manner, a sweeping new law drafted in Europe. The rulemakers were, as always, arriving just after the party had already gotten out of hand. Two fears now sat side by side. The old fear that this was a bubble about to burst, and a brand new fear that it might not burst at all. And then, in November of 2023, the whole contradiction of the year erupted inside the company that started it. On the 17th, the board of OpenAI, the non-profit board specifically built to keep the mission safe, fired its own chief executive, Sam Altman, the public face of the entire boom. The reason was vague, but the fault line underneath was not. Were they moving too fast, building too commercially, for safety to keep up? For about 72 hours, it looked like the most important company in AI might simply tear itself apart. And then, the other side of the pendulum swung back, hard. Almost the entire staff, some 745 of 770 employees, signed a letter threatening to quit and follow Altman out the door. 5 days after firing him, the board reinstated him, and most of the board itself was gone instead. Read it however you like. A victory for momentum, a defeat for caution, a company choosing its accelerator over its brakes. But the lesson was unmistakable. When safety and speed finally collided head-on, in the open, in front of the whole world, speed won in a weekend. So we close the year exactly where the pendulum likes us, unable to agree whether we are building heaven or the bomb. And next time, the machines would learn to do something they had never done before. They would learn to stop and think.